time with getting this thing between it and this chair. The hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning and welcome to our distinguished panel of witnesses. We're here today to learn about the societal impacts and ethical implications of a technology that is rapidly changing our lives, namely artificial intelligence. From friendly robot companions to hostile terminators, artificial intelligence has appeared in film and sparked our imagination for many decades. Today, it is no longer a futuristic idea, at least not artificial intelligence designed for a specific task. Recent advances in computing power and increases in data production and collection have enabled artificial intelligence-driven technology to be used in a growing number of sectors and applications, including in ways we may not realize. It is routinely used to personalize advertisements when we browse the internet. It is also being used to determine who gets hired for a job or what kinds of student essays deserve a higher score. The artificial intelligence systems can be a powerful tool for good, but they also carry risk. The systems have been shown to exhibit gender discrimination when displaying job ads, racial discrimination in predictive policing, and socioeconomic discrimination when selecting zip codes to offer commercial products and services. The systems do not have an agenda, but the humans behind the algorithms can unwittingly introduce their personal biases and perspectives into the design and use of artificial intelligence. The algorithms are then trained with data that is biased in ways both known and unknown. In addition to resulting in discriminatory decision-making, biases in design and training of algorithms can also cause artificial intelligence to fail in other ways. For example, performing worse than clinicians in medical diagnostics. We know that these risks exist. What we do not fully understand is how to mitigate them. We're also struggling with how to protect society against intended misuse and abuse. There's been a proliferation of general artificial intelligence ethics principles by companies and nations alike. The United States recently endorsed an international set of principles for the responsible development. However, the hard work is in the translation of these principles into concrete, effective action. Ethics must be integrated into the earliest stages of the artificial intelligence research and education and continue to be prioritized at every stage of design and deployment. Federal agencies have been investing in this technology for years. The White House recently issued an executive order on maintaining American leadership in artificial intelligence and updated the 2016 National Artificial Intelligence R&D Strategic Plan. These are important steps. However, I also have concerns. First, to actually achieve leadership, we need to be willing to invest. Second, while few individual agencies are making ethics a priority, the administration's executive order and strategic plan falls short in that regard. When mentioning it at all, they approach ethics as an add-on rather than an integral component of the artificial intelligence R&D. From improving healthcare, transportation, and education, to helping to solve poverty and improving climate resilience, artificial intelligence has vast potential to advance the public good. However, this is a technology that will transcend national boundaries. And if U.S. does not address the ethics seriously and thoughtfully, we will lose the opportunity to become a leader in setting the international norms and standards in the coming decades. Leadership is not just about advancing the technology, it is about advancing it responsibly. I look forward to hearing the insights and recommendation from today's expert panel on how the United States can lead in the ethical development of artificial intelligence. I now recognize Mr. Barrett for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for holding this hearing today on the societal and ethical implications of artificial intelligence, AI. In the first half of the 20th century, the concept of artificial intelligence was the stuff of science fiction. Today, it's a reality. Since the term AI was first coined in the 50s, we had made huge advances in the field of artificial narrow intelligence. Narrow AI systems can perform a single task like providing directions through Siri or giving you weather forecasts. This technology now touches every part of our lives and every sector of the economy. Driving the growth of AI is the availability of big data. Private companies and government have collected large data sets, which, combined with advanced computing power, provide the raw material for dramatically improved machine learning approaches and AI algorithms. How this data is collected, used, stored, secured is at the heart of the ethical and policy debate over the use of AI. AI has already delivered significant benefits for U.S. economic prosperity and national security, but it has also demonstrated a number of vulnerabilities, including the potential to reinforce existing social issues and economic imbalances. As we continue to lead the world in advanced computing research, a thorough examination of potential bias, ethics, and reliability challenges of AI is critical to maintaining our leadership in technology. The United States must remain the leader in AI, or we risk letting other countries who don't share our values drive the standards for this technology. To remain the leader in AI, I also believe Americans must understand and trust how AI technologies will use their data. The Trump administration announced earlier this year an executive order on maintaining American leadership in artificial intelligence. Last week, the administration's Select Committee on AI released a report that identifies its priorities for federally funded AI research. I'm glad that the administration is making AI research a priority. This is an effort that is going to require cooperation between industry, academia, and federal agencies. In government, these efforts will be led by agencies under the jurisdiction of this committee, including NIST, NSF, and DOE. We will learn more about one of these research efforts from one of our witnesses today, Dr. Georgia Tourassi, the founding director of the Health Data and Sciences Institute at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Dr. Tourassi's research focuses on deploying AI to provide diagnosis and treatment for cancer. Her project is a good example of how cross-agency collaboration and government data can responsibly drive innovation for public good. I look forward to hearing more about her research. Over the next few months, this committee will be working towards bipartisan legislation to support a national strategy on artificial intelligence. The challenges we must address are how industry, academia, and the government can best work together on AI challenges, including ethical and societal questions, and what role the federal government should play in supporting industry as it drives innovation. I want to thank our accomplished panel of witnesses and their testimony today, and I look forward to hearing what role Congress should play in facilitating this conversation.
Thank you very much. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I will introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Meredith Whittaker. Ms. Whittaker is a distinguished research scientist at New York University and co-founder and co-director of the Artificial Intelligence Now Institute, which is dedicated to researching the social implications of artificial intelligence and related technologies. She has over a decade of experience working in the industry-leading product and engineering teams. Our next witness is Mr. Jack Clark. Mr. Clark is the policy director of OpenAI, where his work focuses on AI policy and strategy. He is also a research fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University and a member of the Center of a New American Security Task Force at AI National Security. Mr. Clark also helps run the AI Index, an initiative from the Standard 100-Year Study of AI to track AI progress. After Mr. Clark is Ms. Joy Buolamwini, who is founder of the Algorithmic Justice League and serves on the Global Tech Panel convened by the Vice President of the European Union to advise leaders and technology executives on ways to reduce the potential harms of AI. She is also a graduate researcher at MIT, where her research focuses on algorithmic bias in computer vision systems. Our last witness, Dr. Georgia Tourassi. Dr. Tourassi is the founding director of the Health Data Sciences Institute and group leader of biomedical sciences, engineering, and computing at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Her research focuses on artificial intelligence for biomedical applications and data-driven biomedical discovery. Dr. Tourassi also serves on the FDA Advisory Committee and Review Panel on Computer-Aided Diagnosis Devices. Our witnesses should know that you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with a round of questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We now will start with Ms. Whittaker.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Baird, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Meredith Whittaker, and I'm the co-founder of the AI Now Institute at New York University. We're the first university research institute dedicated to studying the social implications of artificial intelligence and algorithmic technologies. So the role of AI in our core social institutions is expanding. AI is shaping access to resources and opportunity, both in government and in the private sector, with profound implications for hundreds of millions of Americans. These systems are being used to judge who should be released on bail, to automate disease diagnosis, to hire, monitor, and manage workers, and to persistently track and surveil using facial recognition. These are a few examples among hundreds. In short, AI is quietly gaining power over our lives and institutions, and at the same time, AI systems are slipping farther away from core democratic protections like due process and a right to refusal. In light of this, it is urgent that Congress act to ensure AI is accountable, fair, and just, because this is not what is happening right now. We at AI Now, along with many other researchers, have documented the ways in which AI systems encode bias, produce harm, and differ dramatically from many of the marketing claims made by AI companies. Voice recognition hears masculine-sounding voices better than feminine voices. Facial recognition fails to see Black faces and transgendered faces. Automated hiring systems discriminate against women candidates. Medical diagnostic systems don't work for dark-skinned patients, and the list goes on, revealing a persistent pattern of gender and race-based discrimination, among other forms of identity. But even when these systems do work as intended, they can still cause harm. The application of 100% accurate AI to monitor, track, and control vulnerable populations raises fundamental issues of power, surveillance, and basic freedoms in our democratic society. This reminds us that questions of justice will not be solved simply by adjusting a technical system. Now, when regulators, researchers, and the public seeks to understand and remedy potential harms, they're faced with structural barriers. This is because the AI industry is profoundly concentrated, controlled by just a handful of private tech companies who rely on corporate secrecy laws that make independent testing and auditing nearly impossible. This also means that much of what we do know about AI is written by the marketing departments of these same companies. They highlight hypothetical benevolent uses and remain silent about the application of AI to fossil fuel extraction, weapons development, mass surveillance, and the problems of bias and error. Information about the darker side of AI comes largely thanks to researchers, investigative journalists, and whistleblowers. These companies are also notoriously non-diverse. AI Now conducted a year-long study of diversity in the AI industry, and the results are bleak. To give an example of how bad it is, in 2018, the share of women in computer science professions dropped below 1960 levels. And this means that women, people of color, gender minorities, and others are excluded from shaping how AI systems function, and this contributes to bias. Now, while the costs of such bias are borne by historically marginalized people, the benefits of such systems, from profits to efficiency, accrue primarily to those already in positions of power. This points to problems that go well beyond the technical. We must ask, who benefits from AI, who is harmed, and who gets to decide? This is a fundamental question of democracy. Now, in the face of mounting criticism, tech companies are adopting ethical principles. These are a positive start, but they don't substitute for meaningful public accountability. Indeed, we've seen a lot of PR, but we have no examples where such ethical promises are backed by public enforcement. Congress has a window to act, and the time is now. Powerful AI systems are reshaping our social institutions in ways we're unable to measure and contest. These systems are developed by a handful of private companies whose market interests don't always align with the public good and who shield themselves from accountability behind claims of corporate secrecy. When we are able to examine these systems, too often we find that they are biased in ways that replicate historical patterns of discrimination. It is imperative that lawmakers regulate to ensure that these systems are accountable, accurate, contestable, and that those most at risk of harm have a say in how and whether they are used. So in pursuit of this goal, AI Now recommends that lawmakers first require algorithmic impact assessments in both public and private sectors before AI systems are acquired and used. Second, require technology companies to waive trade secrecy and other legal claims that hinder oversight and accountability mechanisms. Third, require public disclosure of AI systems involved in any decisions about consumers. And fourth, enhance whistleblower protections and protections for conscientious objectors within technology companies. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jack Clark.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Baird, and committee members, thank you for inviting me today. I'm the Policy Director for OpenAI, a technical research lab based in San Francisco. I think the reason why we're here is that AI systems have become, and I'm using air quotes, good enough to be deployed widely in society, but lots of the problems that we're going to be talking about are that good enough, we should ask good enough for who, and we should also ask good enough at what. So to give you some context, recent advances in AI have let us write software that can interpret the contents of an image, understand waveforms in audio, or classify movements in video, and more. At the same time, we're seeing the resources applied to AI development grow significantly. One analysis performed by OpenAI found that the amount of computing power used to train certain AI systems had increased by more than 300,000 times in the last 6 years, correlating to significant economic investments on the part of primarily industry in developing these systems. But though these systems have become better at doing the tasks we set for them, they display problems in deployment. And these problems are typically a consequence of people failing to give the systems the right objectives or giving them the right training data. Some of these problems include popular image recognition systems that have been shown to accurately classify products from rich countries and fail to classify products from poor countries, voice recognition systems that perform extremely badly when dealing with people who are speaking in English that is heavily accented, or commercially available facial recognition systems that consistently misclassify or fail to classify people with darker skin tones. So why these issues arise is because many modern machine learning systems automate tasks that require people to make value judgments. And so when people make value judgments, they encode their values into the system, whether that's the value of who's got to be in the data set or what the task is that it's solving. And because, as my co-panelists have mentioned, these people are not from a particularly diverse background, you can also expect problems to come from these people selecting values that apply to many people. These systems can also fail as a consequence of technical issues. So image classification systems can be tricked using things known as adversarial examples to consistently misclassify things they see in an image. More confusingly and worryingly, we found that you can break these systems simply by putting something in an image that they don't expect to see. And one memorable study did this by placing an elephant in a room, which would cause the image recognition system to misclassify other things in that room, even though it wasn't being asked to look at it. So that gives you a sense of how brittle these systems can be if they're applied in a context which they don't expect. I think, though, that these technical issues are, in a sense, going to be easier to deal with than the social issues. The questions of how these systems are deployed, who is deploying them, and who they're being deployed to sort of help or surveil are the questions that I think we should focus on here. And to that end, I have a few suggestions for things that I think government, industry, and academia can do to increase the safety of these systems. First, I think we need additional transparency. And what I mean by transparency is government should convene academia and industry to create better tools and tests and assessment schemes, such as the algorithmic impact assessment or work like adding a label to data sets which are widely used, so that people know what they're using and have tools to evaluate their performance. Secondly, government should invest in its own measurement, assessment, and benchmarking schemes, potentially via agencies such as NIST. The reason we should do this is that as we have these systems for assessing things like bias, we would probably want to roll them into the civil sector and have a government agency perform regular testing in partnership with academia to give the American people a sense of what these systems are good at, what they're bad at, and most crucially, who they're failing. Finally, I think government should increase funding for interdisciplinary research. So a common problem is these systems are developed by a small number of people from homogeneous backgrounds, and they can also be studied in this way because grants are not particularly friendly to large-scale interdisciplinary research projects. So we should think about ways we can study AI that brings together computer scientists, lawyers, social scientists, philosophers, security experts, and more, not just 20 computer science professionals and a single lawyer, which is some people's definition of interdisciplinary research. So in conclusion, I think we have a huge amount of work to do, but I think that there's real work that can be done today that can let us develop better systems for oversight and awareness of this technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Joy Buolamwini.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Baird, and fellow committee members for the opportunity to testify. I am an algorithmic bias researcher based at MIT. I've conducted studies showing some of the largest recorded racial, skin type, and gender biases in systems sold by IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon. This research exposes limitations of AI systems that are infiltrating our lives, determining who gets hired or fired, and even who's targeted by the police. Research continues to remind us that sexism, racism, ableism, and other intersecting forms of discrimination can be amplified by AI. Harms can arise unintended. The interest in self-driving cars is in part motivated by the promise they will reduce the more than 35,000 annual vehicle fatalities. A June 2019 study showed that for the task of pedestrian tracking, children were less likely to be detected than adults. This finding motivates concerns that children could be at higher risk for being hit by self-driving cars. When AI-enabled technologies are presented as lifesavers, we must ask, which lives will matter? In healthcare, researchers are exploring how to apply AI-enabled facial analysis systems to detect pain and monitor disease. An investigation of algorithmic bias for clinical populations showed these AI systems demonstrated poor performance on older adults with dementia. Age and ability should not impede quality of medical treatment, but without care, AI in health can worsen patient outcomes. Behavior-based discrimination can also occur, as we see with the use of AI to analyze social media content. The US government is monitoring social media activities to inform immigration decisions, despite a Brennan Center report and a USCIS study detailing how such methods are largely ineffective for determining threats to public safety or national security. Immigrants and people in low-income families are especially at risk for having to expose their most sensitive information, as is in the case when AI systems are used to determine access to government services. Broadly speaking, AI harms can be traced first to privileged ignorance. The majority of researchers, practitioners, and educators in the field are shielded from the harms of AI, leading to undervaluation, deprioritization, and ignorance of problems, along with decontextualized solutions. Second, negligent industry and academic norms. There's an ongoing lack of transparency and nuanced evaluations of the limitations of AI. And third, an over-reliance on biased data that reflects structural inequalities coupled with the belief in techno-solutionism. For example, studies of automated risk assessment tools used in the criminal justice system show continued racial bias in the penal system, which cannot be remedied with technical fixes. We must do better. At the very least, government-funded research on human-centered AI should require the documentation of both included and excluded demographic groups. Finally, I urge Congress to ensure funding without conflict of interest is available for AI research in the public interest. After co-authoring a peer-reviewed paper testing gender and skin type bias in an Amazon product, which revealed error rates of 0% for white men and 31% for women of color, I faced corporate hostility as a company vice president made false statements attempting to discredit my MIT research. AI research that exposes harms which challenge business interests need to be supported and protected. In addition to addressing the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which criminalizes certain forms of algorithmic bias research, Congress can issue an AI accountability tax. A revenue tax of just 0.5% on Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, IBM, and Apple would provide more than $4 billion of funding for AI research in the public interest and support people who are impacted by AI harms. Public opposition is already mounting against harmful use of AI, as we see with the recent face recognition ban in San Francisco and a proposal for a Massachusetts statewide moratorium. Moving forward, we must make sure that the future of AI development, research, and education in the United States is truly of the people, by the people, and for all the people, not just the powerful and privileged. Thank you. Next, I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Georgia Tourassi.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Beard, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Georgia Tourassi. I'm a distinguished scientist in the Computing and Computational Sciences Directorate and the director of the Health Data Sciences Institute of the U.S. Department's Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It is an honor to provide this testimony on the role of the Department of Energy and its national laboratories in spearheading responsible use of federal data assets for AI innovation in healthcare. The dramatic growth of AI is driven by big data, massive compute power, and novel algorithms. The Oak Ridge National Lab is equipped with exceptional resources in all three areas. Through the Department of Energy's Strategic Partnership Projects Program, we are applying these resources to challenges in healthcare. Data scientists at Oak Ridge have developed AI solutions to modernize the National Cancer Institute's surveillance program. These solutions are being implemented across several cancer registries where they are documenting high accuracy and improved efficiency, making near real-time cancer incidence reporting a reality. In partnership with the Veterans Administration, the Oak Ridge National Lab has brought its global leadership in computing and big data to the task of hosting and analyzing the VA's vast array of healthcare and genomic data. This partnership brings together VA's data assets with DOE's world-class high-performance computing assets and scientific workforce to enable AI innovation and improve the health of our veterans. These are examples that demonstrate what can be achieved through a federally coordinated AI strategy. But with the great promise of AI comes an even greater responsibility. There are many ethical questions when applying AI in medicine. I will focus on questions related to the ethics of data and the ethics of AI development and deployment. With respect to the ethics of data, the massive volumes of health data must be carefully protected to preserve privacy, even as we extract valuable insights. We need secure digital infrastructure that is sustainable and energy efficient to accommodate the ever-growing data sets and computational AI needs. We also need to address the sensitive issues about data ownership and data use, as the line between research use and commercial use is blurring. With respect to the ethics of AI development and deployment, we know that AI algorithms are not immune to low-quality data or biased data. The DOE national laboratories, working with other federal agencies, could provide a secure and capable compute environment for objective benchmarking and quality control of sensitive data sets and AI algorithms against community consensus metrics. Because one size will not fit all, we need a federally coordinated conversation involving not only the STEM sciences, but also social sciences, economics, law, public policy stakeholders to address the emerging domain-specific complexities of AI use. Last, we must build an inclusive and diverse AI workforce to deliver solutions that are beneficial to all. The Human Genome Project included a program on the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomic research that had a lasting impact on how the entire community, from basic researchers to drug companies to medical workers, used and handled genomic data. The program could be a model for a similar effort to realize the hope of AI in transforming healthcare. The DOE national laboratories are uniquely equipped to support a national strategy in AI research, development, education, and stakeholder coordination that addresses the security, societal, and ethical challenges of AI in healthcare, particularly with respect to federal data assets. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I welcome your questions on this important topic.
Thank you very much. At this point, we will begin our first round of questions, and the chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. My questions will be to all witnesses. This committee has led congressional discussions and action on quantum science, engineering, biology, and many other emerging technologies over the years. In thinking about societal implications and governance, how is AI similar to or different from other transformational technologies, and how should we be thinking about it differently? We'll start with you, Ms. Whittaker.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I think there are many similarities and differences. In the case of AI, as I mentioned in my opening statement and in my written testimony, what you see is a profoundly corporate set of technologies. These are technologies that, because of the requirement to have massive amounts of computational infrastructure and massive amounts of data, aren't available for anyone with an interest to develop or deploy. So when we think about the AI systems that we're talking about here, we're talking generally about systems that are deployed by the private sector in ways that are calibrated ultimately to maximize revenue and profit. And so I think we need to look at the interests that are driving the production and deployment of AI very specifically in this case, and put in place regulations and checks to ensure that those interests don't override the public good.
Mr. Clark.
It's similar in the sense that it's a big deal in the way that like 5G or quantum computers are going to revolutionize chunks of the economy. Maybe the difference is that it's progressing much more rapidly than these technologies, and it's also being deployed at scale much more rapidly. And I think that the different nature of the pace and scale of deployment means we need additional attention here relative to the other technologies that you've been discussing.
I definitely would want to follow up on scale, particularly because even though very few companies tend to dominate the field, the technologies that they deploy can be used by many people around the world. So one example is a company called Megvii that we audited that provides facial analysis capabilities, and more than 100,000 developers use that technology. So you have a case where a technology that is developed by a small group of people can proliferate quite widely, and that biases can also compound very quickly.
So in the context of the panel, I would like to focus on the differences between AI and the technologies that you outlined, quantum computing and others. AI is not simply about computers or about algorithms. It's about its direct application and use by the humans. So it's fundamentally a human endeavor compared to the other technological advances that you outlined.
Is it ever too early to start integrating ethical thinking and considerations into all AI research, education, or training? Or how can the federal science agencies incentivize early integration of ethical considerations in research and education at universities, or even at K through 12 level?
This is a wonderful question. As I mentioned in my written testimony, I think it is never too early to integrate these concerns. And I think we need to broaden the field of AI research and AI development, as many of my co-panelists have said, to include disciplines beyond the technical. So we need to account for, as we say at AI Now, the full stack supply chain, accounting for the contexts in which AI is going to be used, accounting for the experience of the communities who are going to be classified and whose lives are going to be shaped by these systems. And we need to develop mechanisms to include these at every step of decision-making so that we ensure in complex social contexts where these tools are being used that they're safe and that the people most at risk of harm are protected.
Thank you.
Very briefly, I think NSF can better integrate ethics into the aspect of grant making, and also how you can kind of gate for ethics on certain grant applications. And additionally, we should put a huge emphasis on K through 12. I think if you look at the pipeline of people in AI, they drop out earlier than college, and so we should reach them before then.
We're already seeing initiatives where even kids as young as 5 and 6 are being taught AI, and there's an opportunity to also teach issues with bias and the need for responsibility. And we're also starting to see competitions that incentivize the creation of responsible AI curriculum. Mozilla Foundation is conducting one of these competitions right now at the undergraduate level. We also need to look at ways of learning AI that are outside of formal education, and look at the different types of online courses that are available for people who might not enter the field in traditional ways, and make sure that we're also including ethical and responsible considerations in those areas.
Okay. I'm over my time, but go ahead briefly.
As I mentioned in my oral and written testimony, the Human Genome Project presents an excellent example of why and how the ethical, social, and legal implications of AI need to be considered from the beginning, not as an afterthought. Therefore, it should follow both the scientific realm and having dedicated workforce in that particular space with stakeholders from several different entities to certainly protect and remain vigilant in terms of the scientific advances and the deployment implications of the technology.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Tourassi, in this Congress, the House Science Committee has introduced H.R. 617, the Department of Energy Veterans Health Initiative Act, a bill which I am also a co-sponsor. I'm also a Vietnam veteran, and that directs the DOE to establish a research program in AI and high-performance computing is focused on supporting the VA by helping solve big data challenges associated with veterans health care. In your prepared testimony, you highlighted Oak Ridge National Laboratory's work with the joint DOE-VA Million Veterans Program, or MVP champion. So my question is, from your perspective, what was the collaboration process like with the VA?
Sorry. From the scientific perspective, it has been a very interesting and fruitful collaboration. Speaking as a scientist who spent a couple of decades in clinical academia before I moved to the Department of Energy, I would say that there is a cultural shift between the two communities. The clinical community will always be focused on translational value and short-term gains, when the basic scientific community will be focused on not short-term solutions, but disruptive solutions with sustainable value. In that respect, these are two complementary forces, and I applaud the synergy between basic sciences and applied sciences. It is a relay. Without an important application, we cannot drive meaningfully basic science, and vice versa.
Thank you. And continuing on, what do you feel we can accomplish by doing that, managing that large database? What do you think will help in the?
This answer applies not only to the collaboration with the Veterans Administration, but in general in the healthcare space. Healthcare is one of the areas that will be most impacted by artificial intelligence in the 21st century. We have lots of challenges that do have digital solutions that are compute, data intensive, and by extension, energy security and energy consumption is an issue. In that respect, the collaboration between the DOE national laboratories with the exceptional resources and expertise they have in big data management, secure data management, advanced analytics, and with high-performance computing can certainly spearhead the transformation and enable the development and deployment of tools that will have lasting value in the population.
So thank you. And continuing on, in your opinion, who should be responsible for developing interagency collaboration practices when it comes to data sharing and AI?
Again, speaking as a scientist, there are expertise distributed across several different agencies, and all these agencies need to come together to discuss how we need to move forward. I can speak for the national laboratories that they are an outstanding place as federally funded research and development entities to serve as stewards of data assets and of algorithms and to facilitate the benchmarking of data sets and algorithms through the life cycle of the algorithms, serving as the neutral entities. And while using, of course, metrics that are appropriate for the particular application domain and driven by the appropriate other federal agencies.
So one last question then that deals with your prepared testimony. You described the problems that stem from siloed data in healthcare. That relates to what you just mentioned, and you also mentioned the importance of integrating non-traditional data sets, including socioeconomic data. Briefly, I'm running close on time, so you got any thoughts in that?
you asked two different questions. As I mentioned in my testimony, data is the currency, not only for AI, not only in the biomedical space, but across all spaces. And in the biomedical space, we need to be very respectful about the patient's privacy. And that has created silos in terms of where the data reside and how we share the data. That, in some ways, delays scientific innovation.
Thank you, and I wish I had time to ask the other witnesses question, but I'm out of time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. I think this is something that we should be spending a whole lot more time on. The impact that AI is having and will have in the future is something we need to examine very closely. I really want to see AI develop. I understand all the great benefits that can come from it, but there are ethical questions that a tremendous number, things that we have not had to even deal with before. I have introduced the Growing Artificial Intelligence Through Research, or GRADER Act, here in the House because I'm concerned about the current state of AI R&D here in the U.S. There's a Senate companion, which was introduced by my colleagues, Senators Heinrich, Portman, and Schatz. Now, I want to make sure that we do the technical research, but also have to do the research and see what we may need to do here in Congress to so that AI devices are developed consistent with our American values. I've focused a lot on this committee because I'm a political scientist. I focus a lot on the importance of social science, and I think it's critically important that social science is not left behind when it comes to being funded, because social science has applications to so much technology, and certainly in AI. So I want to ask, when it comes to social science research, and I'll start with Ms. Whittaker, what gaps do you see in terms of the social science research that has been done on AI, and what do you think can and should be done, or what should we be doing here in Washington about this?
Thank you. I love this question because I firmly agree that we need a much more broad disciplinary approach to studying AI. When I look at the research that has been done to date, most of the time when we talk about AI research, we're talking about technical research, and we might pin social science on at the end or other disciplinary expertise, but we are not looking at the study of AI through a multi or interdisciplinary lens. And it's really important that we do this because the technical component of AI is actually a fairly narrow piece. When you begin to deploy AI in contexts like criminal justice or hiring or education, you have a broad context with its own history, with its own legal regimes, with its own disciplinary expertise that goes back, that has a whole field of study behind it. So those fields need to be incorporated, and we need social scientists and others with the skills to understand the socio-technical systems within which these technologies are being applied. And I think along every step of the way, from development, when we're considering what data do we use in AI, to deployment, when we are working with the communities on the ground to make sure that it's working as intended, even given sort of dynamic reality and context, we need to think about AI much more broadly and incorporate these perspectives at every step.
Mr. Clark?
OpenAI, we recently hired our first social scientist. So that's one. We need, obviously, many more. And we wrote an essay called Why AI Safety Needs Social Scientists. And the observation there is that, along with everything Ms. Whittaker said, we should embed social scientists with technical teams on projects. Because a lot of AI projects are going to become about values, and technologists are not great at understanding human values, but social scientists are and have tools to help us understand them. So my specific pitch is to have federally funded centers of excellence where you bring social scientists together with technologists to work on applied things.
Thank you. Anyone else?
So I would say in my own experience, reading from the social sciences actually enabled me to bring new innovations to computer vision. So in particular, my research talks about intersectionality, which was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar who was looking at anti-discrimination law and showed that if you only did single access evaluation, let's say you looked at discrimination by race or discrimination by gender, people who were at the intersection were being missed. And I found that this was the same case for the evaluation of the effectiveness of computer vision AI systems. So for example, when I did the test of Amazon, when you look at just men or women, if you have a binary, if you look at darker skin or lighter skin, you'll see some discrepancies. But when you do an intersectional analysis, that's where we saw 0% error rates for white men versus 31% error rates for women of color. And it was that insight from the social sciences to start thinking about looking at intersectionality. And so I would posit that we not only look at social sciences being something that is a help, but is something that is integral.
As a STEM scientist, I cannot speak to the gaps in social sciences, but I know from my own work that for AI technology to be truly impactful, the STEM scientists need to be deeply embedded in the application space, to work very closely with the users so that we make sure that we answer the right questions, not the questions that we want to answer as engineers. And in the biomedical space, we need to be thinking not only about social sciences, we need to be thinking about patient advocacy groups as well.
Thank you very much. Dr. Babin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. Mr. Clark and Ms. Tourassi, I have the privilege of representing Southeast Texas, which includes the Johnson Space Center. And as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics, I've witnessed the diverse ways that NASA has been able to use and develop AI, optimizing research and exploration and making our systems and technology much more efficient. Many of the new research missions at NASA have been enhanced by AI in ways that were not previously even possible. As a matter of fact, AI is a key piece to NASA's next rover mission to Mars, and we could see the first mining of asteroids in the Kuiper Belt with the help of AI. I say all of this to not only to feature the ways that AI is used in the area of data collection and in space exploration, but to highlight private-public partnerships that have led to several successful uses of AI in this field. Where do you see other private-public partnership opportunities with federal agencies increasing the efficiency and the security using AI? Dr. Tourassi, if you'll answer first, and then Mr. Clark.
Absolutely. The DOE national labs, as federally funded research and development entities, we work very closely with industry in terms of licensing and deploying technology in a responsible way. So this is something that is already hardwired in how we do science and how we translate science.
Thank you very much. Mr. Clark.
My specific suggestion is joint work on robustness, predictability, and broadly safety, which basically decodes to, I have a big image classifier, a person from industry and a person from government both want to know that that's going to be safe and it will serve people effectively, and we should pursue joint projects in this area.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And again, same too, what would it mean for the United States if another country were to gain dominance in AI, and how do we maintain global leadership in this very important study and issue? Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely, it is imperative for our national security and economic competitiveness that we are at the bleeding edge of the technology, and we make responsible R&D investments. In an area that I believe that we can lead the world is that we can actually lead not only with the technological advances, but with what we talked about, socially responsible AI. We can lead that dialogue, that conversation for the whole world.
Excellent.
And that differentiates us from other entities investing in the
Yes.
space.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Clark.
So I agree, but just to sort of reiterate this, AI lets us encode values into systems that are then scaled against sometimes entire populations. And so along with us needing to work here in the US on what appropriate values are for these systems, which is its own piece of work, as we've talked about, if we fail here, then the values that our society lives under are partially determined by whichever society wins in AI. And so the values that that society encodes become the values that we experience. So I think the stakes here are societal in nature, and we should not think of this as about a technological challenge, but how we as a society want to become better. And the success here will be the ability to articulate values that the rest of the world thinks are the right ones to be embedded. So it's a big challenge.
It is a big challenge. What would the, if we do not maintain our primacy in this, then other countries who might be very repressive with less, lofty values that I assume that's what you're talking about, then could put these into effect in a very detrimental way. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Buolamwini.
Thank you to the chair and the ranking member, but really thank you to our panelists here. I first want to note that the panel we have today is not representative of people who work in the tech field. And I think that is something we need to be aware of, because I think it's still probably about 20% women, but so I just want to point that out. This is an important conversation, and I'm glad we're having it now. I think you've sent the message that it's not too late, but we really need to raise awareness and figure out if there's policies. If we're talking about the societal part, we have here in this country some of the best scientists, researchers, programmers, engineers, and we've seen some pretty tremendous progress, but over the years, we've talked and spoken in this committee, and I represent a district in Oregon where we've had lots of conversations about the challenges of integrating AI into our society, what's happening with the workforce in that area. But we really do need to understand better the socioeconomic effects, and especially the biases that it can create. And I appreciate that you have brought those to our attention, I mean, particularly for people of color. And as my colleagues on this committee know, I serve as the founder and co-chair of the Congressional STEAM Caucus to advocate for the integration of arts and design into STEM fields. In The Innovators, the author Walter Isaacson talked about how the intersection of arts and science is where the digital age creativity is going to occur. STEAM education recognizes the benefits of both the arts and sciences, and it can also create more inclusive classrooms, especially in the K-12 system. And I wanted to ask Ms. Buolamwini, I hope I said your name properly.
Buolamwini.
I appreciate that in your testimony, you mentioned the creative science initiatives that are incorporating the arts in outreach to more diverse audiences that may never otherwise encounter information about the challenges of AI. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we in Congress can support partnerships between industry, academia, stakeholders to better increase awareness about the biases that exist. Because until we have more diversity, it's all about what goes in, that sort of algorithmic accountability, I think, if you will. And if we don't have diversity going in to the process, it's going to affect what's coming out. So.
Absolutely. So in addition to being a computer scientist, I'm also a poet. And one of the ways I've been getting the word out is through spoken word poetry. So I just opened an art exhibition in the UK, in the Barbican. That's a part of a 5-year traveling art show, which is meant to connect with people who might otherwise not encounter some of the issues that are going on with AI. Something I would love for Congress to do is to institute a public-wide education campaign. Something I've been thinking about is a project called Game of Tones, product testing for inclusion. So what you could do—
Clever name already.
So what you could do is use existing consumer products. So maybe it's voice recognition, tone of voice. Maybe it's what we're doing with analyzing social media feeds, tone of text. Maybe it's something that's to do with computer vision, and use that as a way of showing how the technologies people encounter every day can encode certain sorts of problems, and most importantly, what can be done about it. So it's not just we have these issues, but here are steps forward. Here are
That's great.
resources you can reach out.
I serve on the education committee as well. I really appreciate that. Ms. Whittaker, your testimony talks about when these systems fail, they fail in ways that harm those who are already marginalized. And you mentioned that we have yet to encounter an AI system that was biased against white men as a standalone identity. So increasing diversity, of course, in the workforce is an important first step. But what checks can we put in place to make sure that historically marginalized communities are part of the decision-making process that is leading up to the deployment of AI?
Absolutely. Well, as I discussed in my written testimony, and as AI Now's Rashida Richardson has shown in her research, we need to, in part, look at how the data we're using in AI is created. Because, of course, the data is a reflection of the world we have now and the world of the past. And the world of the past has a sadly discriminatory history. So that data is going to imprint those histories and oftentimes freeze them in AI systems that scale them into, broad social.
What efforts are being done at this point in time to do that?
There are some efforts. The data sheets for data sets paper propose sort of appending information about the collection and creation process of data to databases that are used in AI. At the AI Now Institute, we have the Data Genesis Project that does deep social scientific research and historiographic research on how different data sets that are used in AI are made. And in the Dirty Data paper that Rashida was the lead author on, we looked at policing data, and we found that in 9 precincts that were using or developing predictive policing systems, they had been found, and they were under government oversight or investigation, to be conducting corrupt or racially biased policing. And so what you have there
Very
is
concerning.
policing practices that are creating the data that is then used in these systems with no checks and no national standards on how that data is applied within these systems.
Thank you. And I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marshall.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. My first question for Dr. Tourassi. In your prepared testimony, you highlighted that the DOE's partnership with the Cancer Institute Surveillance, Epidemiology, and In Results program. Can you explain the data collection process for this program and how the data is kept secure? In what ways have you noted the DOE accounts for artificial intelligence ethics, bias, or reliability this program? And you also mentioned things like cancer biomarkers that AI are currently unable to predict to produce information on this.
The particular partnership with the National Cancer Surveillance Program is organized as follows. Cancer is a reportable disease in the US and in other developed countries. Therefore, every single cancer case that is detected in the US is recorded in a local registry. When the partnership was established, the partnership included voluntary participation of cancer registries that wanted to contribute their data to advance R&D. The data resides in the Secure Data Enclave at the Oak Ridge National Lab, where we have the highest regulations and accreditations for holding the data. Access to the data is given responsibly to researchers from the DOE complex that have the proper training to access the data, and that is our test bed for developing AI technology. The first targets of that science was how we can develop tools that help cancer registries become far more efficient in what they do. It's not about replacing the individual, it's actually helping them do something better and faster. So the first set of tools that are deployed are exactly that, to abstract information from pathology reports that the cancer registrars have to report on an annual basis to NCI, and we free time for them to devote to other tasks that are far more challenging for artificial intelligence, and such as the biomarker extraction that you talked about.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll address my next question to Mr. Clark, but then probably open it up to the rest of the panel after that. How do you incentivize developers to build appropriate safety and security into products when the benefits may not be immediately evident to users?
I think technologists always love competing with each other, and so I'm pretty bullish on the idea of creating benchmarks and challenges which can encourage people to enter systems into this. You could imagine competitions for who's got the least biased system, which actually is something you can imagine commercial companies wanting to participate in. You do need to change the norms of the development community so that individual developers see this as important, and that probably requires earlier education and adding an ethics component to developer education as well.
Okay. Ms. Whittaker, would you like to respond as well?
Absolutely. I would add to what Mr. Clark said to say that, I think you would also need to add to competitions liability. If people are developing systems that are having profound impacts on the lives and livelihoods of populations, they should be responsible for those impacts, especially since most developers are not working alone as part of a hobby project, but working within large industries where the incentives and drivers for development are set by the market incentives of a given company.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Mix Buolamwini. Sorry, I missed the introductions there.
Buolamwini, you're fine. And so something else we might consider is something akin to public interest law clinics, but are meant for public interest technology, so that it's part of your computer science or AI education, that you're working with a clinic that's also connected to communities that are actually harmed by some of these processes. So it's part of how you come to learn.
Okay, thanks. And Dr. Tourassi, you get to bat cleanup. Anything you want to add?
I don't really have anything to add to this question. I think the other panelists captured it very well.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shuriel.
Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists for coming today. This hearing is on the societal and ethical implications of AI, and I'm really interested in the societal dimension when it comes to the impact AI is having on the workforce and how it's increasingly going to shape the future of work. So my first question to the panel is, what will the shift in AI mean for jobs across the country? Will the shift to an economy increasingly transformed by AI be evenly distributed across regions, across ethnic groups, across men and women? Will it be evenly distributed throughout our job sectors? And how do you see the percentages of how AI is impacting the workforce changing over the years? Which portion of our workforce will be impacted directly by AI, and how will that look for society?
Thank you. Well, I think we're already seeing AI impact the workforce and impact what it means to have a job. We're seeing AI integrated into hiring and recruiting. A company called HireVue now offers video interview services that claim to be able to tell whether somebody is a good candidate based on the way they move their face, their micro expressions, their tone of voice. Now, how this works across different populations and different skin tones and different genders is unclear because this technology is proprietary. We are seeing AI integrated into management and worker control. A company called Cogito offers a service to call centers that will monitor the tone of voice and the affect of people on the phone and give them instructions to be more empathic to close the call. It also sends their managers a ranking of how they're doing, and performance assessments can then be based on whatever the machine determines this person is doing well or doing poorly. We're seeing similar mechanisms in Amazon warehouses where workers' productivity rates are being set by algorithms that are continually extracting more labor. We've actually seen workers in Michigan walk out of warehouses protesting what they consider inhumane algorithmic management. And finally, we are seeing, and I will leave it there, but we are seeing the nature of work reshaped by algorithmic systems, often in ways that rely on worker tracking and surveillance and don't allow workers and those who are profiled to contest or even really the right to consent to the use of these systems.
And what about, we can go back to you too, and you can go back to the question if you'd want, Ms. Buolamwini. But to what extent is it going to transfer the ability of people to get jobs and get into the workforce?
So one thing I wanted to touch upon is how AI is being used to terminate jobs, and something I call the exclusion overhead, where people who are not designed for the system have to expend more energy to actually be a part of the system. One example comes from several reports of transgender drivers being kicked off of Uber accounts because when they used a fraud detection system, which uses facial recognition to see if you are who you say you are, given that they present differently, there were more checks required. So one driver reported that over an 18-month period, she actually had to undergo 100 different checks, and then eventually her account was deactivated. On May 20th, another Uber driver actually sued Uber for more than $200,000 after having his account deactivated because he had to lighten his photos so that his face could be seen by these systems. And then there was no kind of recourse, no due process in that he couldn't even reach out to say the reason I lightened my photo, right, was because the system wasn't detecting.
Was failing.
Yeah.
And so also in my district, and this is to the panel, again, I've seen our community colleges and polytechnical schools engaging in conversations with businesses about how they can best train workers to meet the new challenges of the AI workforce and provide them with the skills. Structurally, how does secondary education need to adjust to be able to adapt to the changing needs and the changing challenges that you're outlining? How can we better prepare students to enter into this workforce?
I'll just do a very quick point. We do not have the data to say how AI will affect the economy. We have strong intuitions from everyone who works in AI that it will affect the economy dramatically. And I'd say before we think about what we need to teach children, we need a real study of how it's impacting things. None of us are able to give you a number on employment.
And just because I have 6 seconds, what would you suggest to us to focus on in that study?
I think it would be useful to look at the tractability for in-development technologies to be applied at large scale throughout the economy, and to look at the economic impacts of existing things like how we've automated visual analysis and what economic impacts that has had. Because it's been dramatic, but we don't have the data from which to talk about it.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our panel for being here today on this very important topic. Mr. Clark, I want to start my line of questioning with you. It's my belief that the United States needs to lead on machine learning and AI, if for no other reason, for the sake of standards development, especially when you think about the economic race between ourselves and China. One, I guess, first question, do you share that concern? And then two, if yes, what concerns would you have in a world where China is the one that is sort of leading the AI evolution, if you will, and dictating standards globally?
Yes, I agree. And to answer your second question, I think if you don't define the standard, then you have less ability to figure out how the standard's going to change your economy and how you can change industry around it. So it just puts you behind the curve. It means that your economic advantage is going to be less, you're going to be less well-oriented in the space. And if you don't invest in the people to go and make those standards, then you're going to have lots of highly qualified, reasonable people from China making those. And they'll develop skills, and then we won't get to make them.
Yeah, thank you. And then Dr. Tourassi, another question that I have is around data ownership and data privacy. We talk about the promise of AI a lot, and it is certainly there. I don't know that we talk enough about how to empower individuals with control over their data, who are ultimately the ones providing the value without even choosing to provide all this data. So in your opinion, how should we at the committee level and as a Congress think about balancing that trade-off between data privacy and ownership for the individual and the innovation that we know is coming?
This is actually an excellent question and fundamental in healthcare space. Because in the end, all the AI algorithmic advances that are happening wouldn't be possible if the patients did not contribute their data and if the healthcare providers did not provide the services that collect the data. So in the end, who owns the product? This is a conversation that requires as a society to have these pointed conversations about these issues and to bring all the different stakeholders into place. Privacy and ownership mean different things to different people. One size will not fit all. We need to have to build a framework in place so that we can address these questions per application domain, per situation that arises.
Thank you. And sort of, this one's maybe for everybody. Sort of a take on that. Deepfakes is something that we've been hearing a little bit more of lately, and I think the risk here is profound, where we get into a world where you literally cannot tell the difference between me calling you on the phone physically or a machine producing my voice. So as we think about that, I guess my question would be, how can the NSF or other federal agencies ensure that we have the tools available to detect these deepfakes as they come into our society? We'll start with Ms. Whittaker.
Well, I think this is an area where we need much more research funding and much more development. I would also expand this answer to include looking at the environments in which such sensational content might thrive. And so you're looking at engagement-driven algorithmic systems like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And I think addressing the way in which those algorithms surface sensational content is something that needs to go hand in hand with detection efforts, because fundamentally there is an ecology that rests below the surface that is promoting the use of these kind of content.
Completely agree. Thank you.
I agree with these points, and I'd just make one point in addition, which is that we need to know where these technologies are going. We could have had a conversation about deepfakes 2 years ago, if you looked at the research literature, and government should invest to look at the literature today because they will change.
We also need to invest in AI literacy, where you know that there will be people deploying AI in ways that are meant to be intentionally harmful. So I think making sure people have an awareness that deepfakes can exist and other ways of deception that can arise from AI systems exist as well.
Thank you.
So adversarial use of AI technology is a reality.
Yeah.
It's here. Therefore, the investments in R&D and having an entity that will serve as the neutral entity to be the steward of the technology and the data sets is a very important piece that we need to consider very carefully and make related investments. This is not a one-time solution, something is clean, ready to go. The vulnerabilities will always exist. So we need to have the processes and the entities in place to mitigate the risks. And I go back to my philosophy. I believe in what Marie Curie said, there is nothing to be feared, only to be understood. So let's make the R&D investments to understand, make the most of the potential, and mitigate the risks.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. McNerney.
Well, thank you. I thank the chairwoman, and I thank the panelists. Testimony is excellent. I think you all have some recommendations that are good and are going to be helpful in us, guiding us and move forward. But I want to look at some of those recommendations. One of your recommendations, Ms. Whittaker, is to require tech companies to waive their secrecy. Now, that sounds great, but in practice, it's going to be pretty difficult, especially in light of our competition on the international scene with China and other countries. How do you envision that happening? How do you envision tech companies opening up their trade secrets without losing the competition?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I expand on in my written testimony, this is the vision of this recommendation is not simply that tech companies throw open the door and everything is open to everyone. This is specifically looking at claims of trade secrecy that are preventing accountability. So I think a nudge from regulators might help here, but we need independent oversight and provisions that waive trade secrecy for independent auditors, for researchers who are looking at issues of bias and fairness and inaccuracy in these systems, and for those who are examining what different contexts these systems are being licensed and applied in. Because a lot of the AI that we see is actually, it's created by the large tech companies, and then it's licensed to third parties who use it in one or another context. Those contracts are usually secret. Even the fact that there is a contract between, say, Amazon and another entity to license, say, facial recognition is not something that the public who would be profiled by such systems would know. And that makes tracing issues of bias, issues of basic freedoms, issues of misuse extremely hard.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Clark, I love the way you said that AI encodes the value system of its coders. You cited 3 recommendations. Do you think those 3 recommendations you cited will ensure a broader set of values would be incorporated in AI systems?
I'd describe them as necessary but not sufficient. I think that they need to be done along with larger series of things to encode values. I mean, values is a personal question. It's about how we as a society evaluate what fairness means in a commercial marketplace. And I think that AI is going to highlight all of the ways in which our current systems for sort of determining that need additional work. So I don't have additional suggestions beyond those I make, but I suspect they're out there.
And the idea to have NIST create standards, I mean, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, my general observation is we have a large number of great research efforts being done on bias and issues like it. And if we have a part of government convene those efforts and create testing suites, we can create the sorts of loose standards that other people can start to test in, and it generates more data for the research community to make recommendations from.
I think. Ms. Buolamwini, you recommended a 5% AI accountability tax. How did you arrive at that figure, and how do you see that being implemented?
So this one was a 0.5% tax, and
0.5%.
and you have the Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2019 that was sponsored by Representative Yvette Clarke. And I think it could be something that is added to that particular piece of legislation. And so the requirement that they specifically have is this would be for companies that are making over $50 million in revenue or average gross. And then also it would either apply to companies that have or possess over 1 million consumer devices or reach more than 1 million consumers. So I could see it being integrated into a larger framework that's already about algorithmic accountability.
Thank you. Ms. Whittaker and Ms. Buolamwini, you both advocated, in fact, all of you did, for a more diverse workforce. I've written legislation to do that. It really doesn't go anywhere around here. What's a realistic way to get that done? How do we diversify the workforce here?
Well, I would hope that people continue to try to write legislation and make it effective, because we have a diversity crisis in this industry. It has not gotten better. It has gotten worse in spite of years and years of diversity rhetoric and PR. We're looking at an industry where...
So you think government is the right tool to make that happen?
I think we need to use as many tools as we have. I think we need to mandate pay equity and transparency. We need to mandate much more thorough protections for people who are the victims of sexual harassment in the workplace. This is a problem that tech has. And we need to look at the practice of hiring and leveling, because you see a pattern within these companies where women and people of color are hired for positions that are far below the level that men are hired at, even though they have the similar qualifications. I would add that we also need to look at the practice of hiring increasing numbers of contract workers. These workers are extremely vulnerable to harassment and discrimination. They don't have the protection of full-time employees, and you have seen at Google at this point, more than half the workforce is made up of contract workers across all job types. So this isn't just janitorial staff or service workers. This is engineers, designers, team leads that don't have the privileges of full employment and thus don't have the safety to push back against inequity.
I've run out of time, so I can't pursue that. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And yes, I have two questions. Sorry, I was running from another markup. Dr. Tourassi, the University of Puerto Rico Mayagüez campus, which is in my district, is an artificial intelligence education and research institute that facilitates the exposure of young students to the field of artificial intelligence. Their core mission is to advance knowledge and provide education in artificial intelligence theory, methods, systems, and applications to contribute to human society and to economic prosperity. My question will be, in your view, how can we engage with institutes of higher education to promote similar initiative or efforts, keeping in mind and generating interest in artificial intelligence in young students from all areas, and how we can, how can we be secure that what is produced later on is responsible, ethical, and financially profitable?
So as you mentioned, the earlier we start recruiting workforce, our trainees, that reflect the actual workforce with the education and the diversity that is needed, that is extremely important. When the AI developers reflect the actual user community, then we know that we have arrived. That cannot be achieved only with academic institutions. This is a societal responsibility for all of us. I can tell how the national laboratories are working in this space. We are enhancing the academic places and opportunities by offering internship opportunities to students who often otherwise they do not come from research institutions, and this is the first time for them that they can work in a thriving research place. So we need to be thinking more outside the box and how we can all work synergistically and continuously on this.
Thank you. I want to share with you as well that my office recently had a meeting with a representative of the spinal injury organization. And they were commenting of the challenges they have on approaching American manufacturers, specifically car manufacturers, on accessible autonomous vehicles. Several constituents with disabilities rely on them or on similar equipment for maintaining some degree of independence and rehabilitation. My question will be, in your view, how can we engage that private sector you was just talking a few seconds ago, and the manufacturers, that so we not only ensure that artificial intelligence products are ethical and inclusive, but provide opportunities for all sectors of the community. In other words, make this working for everyone. How can we arrange that?
If I understood your question, you're asking how we can build more effective bridges.
In your view, yes, it's kind of the same thing.
And again, I can speak to how we are building these bridges as national laboratories, working with both academic and research institutions, as well as with private industry, creating very thriving hubs for researchers to engage in societally impactful science and develop solutions, end-to-end solutions, from R&D all the way to the translation of these products. I see the federally funded R&D entities such as national labs being one form of these bridges.
How we can make that people with disabilities can be counted for when we talk about artificial intelligence?
Well, as I said, one size will not fit all. It will come down to the particular application domain. So it is our responsibility as scientists to be mindful of that. And while working deeply embedded in the application space with the other sciences that will educate us on where the gaps are, that's how we can save ourselves from all the blind spots.
You said in your testimony, you highlighted the importance of an inclusive and diverse artificial intelligence workforce. For you, what is the greatest challenge in the United States of developing this kind of workforce?
As a female STEM scientist and often a token woman for the past 3 decades in the field, the biggest challenge we have is not actually recruiting a diverse set of trainees, but also sustaining them in the workforce. And I passionately believe that we need to change our notion of what is leadership. There are different models of leadership, and the more we become comfortable with the different styles of leadership. In my own group, in my own team, I make sure that I have a very diverse group of researchers, including people with disabilities, doing phenomenal AI research work. So it comes down to not only developing policies, but what is our also individual responsibility as citizens.
Thank you, and you're back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for holding the hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us. Artificial intelligence is sparking revolutionary change across industries and fields of study. Its benefits will drive progress in healthcare, climate change, energy, and more. AI can help us diagnose diseases early by tracking patterns in personal medical history. It can help identify developing weather systems, providing early warning to help communities escape harm. Across my home state of New York, companies, labs, and universities are conducting innovative research and education in AI, including the AI Now Institute at New York University, represented here with us today by co-founder Meredith Whittaker. Students at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy study machine logic at the Rensselaer AI and Reasoning Lab, work that could transform our understanding of human-machine communication. IBM and SUNY Polytechnic Institute have formed a groundbreaking partnership to develop an AI hardware lab in Albany focused on developing computer chips and other AI hardware. That partnership is part of a broader $2 billion commitment by IBM in our home state, in my home state. This work is more than technical robotics. University of Albany researchers are working on ways to detect AI-generated deep-fake video alterations to prevent the spread of fake news, an issue that has already impacted some of our colleagues in Congress. These researchers are using metrics such as human blinking rates to weed out deep-fake videos from authentic ones. AI presented great benefits, but it is a double-edged sword. In some studies, AI was able to identify individuals at risk for mental health conditions just by scanning their social media accounts. This can help medical professionals identify and treat those most at risk, but it also raises privacy issues for individuals. We have also seen evidence of data and technical bias that underrepresents or misrepresents people of color in everything from facial recognition to Instagram filters. As a committee, I'm confident that we will continue to explore both the benefits and risks associated with AI, and I look forward to learning more from our witnesses today. And my question for all panelists is this: what is an example that illustrates the potential of AI, and what is an example that illustrates the risks? Anyone? Ms. Whittaker.
Yeah, I will use the same example for both because I think this gives a sense of the double-edged sword of this technology. We have seen at Google, DeepMind, one of the AI research lab that they acquired, apply artificial intelligence to issues of data center energy consumption. And they were able to reduce their energy consumption by something like 40% by sort of using machine learning to optimize, when a fan is turned on, et cetera, and have much more precise calibration for energy use. So this is great. This shows that this can be applied to the large-scale data sets and potentially to climate. But we've also seen research produced recently, and I cite this in my written testimony, that shows the extensive energy consumption of training AI models, of running the vast computational infrastructure needed, and of deploying these systems. And you saw a recent study that showed that the amount of carbon produced to train one state-of-the-art language detection model was the amount that would be produced by 5 cars in its lifetime. So you're seeing significant energy consumption that is not often accounted for when we think about the benefits of AI as a dematerialized set of technologies.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Very, very quickly.
Mr. Clark.
So one of the big potentials of AI is in healthcare, and specifically sharing data sets across not just states and local boundaries, but eventually across countries. I think we can create global class diagnostic systems to save people's lives. Now, a risk is that all of these things need to be evaluated empirically after we've created them for things like bias. And I think that we lack the tools, funding, and institutions to do that empirical evaluation of developed systems safely.
Okay, Ms. Buolamwini.
Yes, so I look at computer vision systems where I see both costs for inclusion and costs for exclusion. So when you're using a vision system to say, detect a pedestrian, you would likely want that to be as accurate as possible as to not hit individuals. But that's also the same kind of technology you could put on a drone with a gun to target an individual as well. So making sure that we're balancing the cost of inclusion and the cost of exclusion and putting in context limitations where you say there are certain categorical uses we are not considering.
Thank you. And Ms. Tourassi, please.
Yes, I agree with Mr. Clark that in the healthcare space, the promise of AI is evident with clinical decision support systems, for example, for reducing the risk of medical error in the diagnostic interpretation of images. However, that same field that shows many great examples is full of studies that overhype expectations of universal benefits because these studies are limited to one medical center, to a small population. So we need to become, as I said, educated consumers of the technology and the hype, the news that are out there. We need to be asking these questions. How extensively this tool has been used, across how many populations, how many states, how many, when we dive into the details and we do that benchmarking that Mr. Clark alluded to, then we know that the promise is real. And there are studies that have done that with the rigor required.
Thank you so much. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for holding this hearing. I really want to thank our four panelists for really responsible, credible testimony. I'm going to save all of these printed texts and share them with many friends. In the last 4 years on the Science Committee, AI has come up again and again and again, and we've only had glancing blows at the ethics or the societal implications. We've mostly been talking the math and the machine learning and the promise. Even yesterday, we had Secretary Rick Perry. I can't remember which department he represents, but he was here yesterday. I'm just kidding. Raving about artificial intelligence and machine learning. And thanks, too, for the concrete recommendations. We don't often always get that in the Science Committee, but I counted. There are 24 concrete recommendations that you guys offered, everything from waiving trade secrecy to benchmarking machine learning for its societally harmful failures to even an AI tax, which my friends on Ways and Means will love. But the one ethical societal failure that we haven't talked about is sort of driven by everything you did. One of your papers and talked about the 300,000 time increase in machine learning power in the last 5 or 6 years, compared to Moore's Law, which would have been 12 times at the same time. In Virginia, we have something like 35,000 AI jobs we're looking to fill right now. And one of the other papers talked about awareness. And we have certainly had computer scientists here in the last couple of years who talked about ambition, awareness. So let me ask the Skynet question. What do you do about the big picture when, well, as my daughter already says, Wall Street is almost completely run right now by machine learning. I mean, it's all algorithms. I visited the floor of the New York Stock Exchange a couple of weeks ago with the Ways and Means Committee, and there were very few people there. The people all disappeared. It's all done algorithmically. So let's talk about the big picture. Any thoughts on the big picture societal implication of when AI is running all the rest of our lives?
I think it's pretty clear that AI systems are scaling and they're going to become more capable, and at some point will allow them to have larger amounts of autonomy. I think the responsible thing to do is to build the institutions today that will be robust to like really powerful AI systems. And that's why I'm calling for large-scale measurement, assessment, and benchmarking of existing systems deployed today. And that's because if we do that work today, then as the systems change, we'll have the institutions that we can draw on to assess the growing opportunities and threats of these systems. I really think it's as simple as being able to do weather forecasting for this technical progress, and we lack that infrastructure today.
Ms. Buolamwini, I'm going to mispronounce your name, but you're at MIT, you're right next to Steve Pinker at Harvard. They're doing all this amazing work on the evolution of consciousness. and consciousness as an emergent property, one you don't necessarily intend, but there it is. Shouldn't we worry about emergent consciousness in AI, especially as we build capacity?
I mean, the worry about conscious AI, I think sometimes misses the real world issues of dumb AIs that are not well trained, right? So when I go back to an example I did in my opening statement, I talk about a recent study that came out showing pedestrian tracking technologies had a higher miss rate for children, right, as compared to adults. So here we were worried about the AIs becoming sentient, and the ones that are leading to the fatalities are the ones that weren't even well trained.
Well, I'd be grateful among the 24 thoughtful, excellent suggestions you made, and hopefully we will follow up on many of them, or the ones that are congressionally appropriate, is one more that doesn't deal with the kids who get killed, which is totally good. The issues of ageism, sexism, racism that show up, those are all very, very meaningful. But I think we also need to look long-term, which is what good leaders do, about the sentience issue and how we protect, not necessarily make sure it doesn't happen, but how we protect. And thank you very much for being part of this. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamb.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. A couple of you have hit on some issues about AI as it relates to working people, both in the hiring process, discriminating against who they're going to hire and bias sort of embedded in what they're doing, as well as the concerns about AI just displacing people's jobs. But I was wondering if any of you could go into a little more detail on AI in the existing workplace and how it might be used to control working people, to worsen their working conditions. I can envision artificial intelligence applications that could sort of interrupt nascent efforts to organize a workplace, or maybe in an organized workplace, a union that wants to bargain over the future of AI in that workplace, but they're not able to access the sort of data to understand what it even is they're bargaining over. So I don't know if you can give any examples from present day where these types of things are already happening, or just address what we can do to take on those problems as they evolve, because I think they're going to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can provide a couple of examples, and I'll start by saying that as my co-founder at AI Now, Kate Crawford, and legal scholar Jason Schultz have pointed out, there are basically no protections for worker privacy. So AI relies on data, and there are many, many companies and services that offer surveillance of workers, and there are many companies that are now offering the capacity to analyze that data and make determinations about workers based on that. So are you typing in a way that matches the profile of someone who might quit, right? A lot of these claims are essentially pseudoscientific, but it doesn't mean that your managers or your bosses can't act on them. There are no protections there. So I think we really need stronger privacy protections and validation of some of the claims that are being made. I can make a couple of examples of where we're seeing pushback against AI. Again, I mentioned the Amazon warehouse workers. Well, it was revealed recently that Amazon has a kind of management algorithm in their warehouses, and that this algorithm tracks performance based on a sensor that workers wear that sort of tracks how well they're doing against an algorithmically set performance rate. And if they miss their rate, this algorithm can issue performance warnings. It can actually terminate workers automatically. So you're looking at these systems that are calibrated by those in power to extract as much labor as possible without any recourse for these workers. You saw, of course, Uber drivers who struck around the Uber IPO around issues that their wages, their kind of rate per drive had been cut arbitrarily and dramatically. They didn't even have any recourses there. You saw that Virginia teachers strike a couple of years ago that actually kicked off around the mandate that they had to wear a tracking device in order to receive health insurance. You've seen students sitting in, so protesting kind of AI-based sort of e-education, so kind of protesting the requirement that they sit at a screen all day and have their education doled out by a computational system that is connected to Facebook. There are many, many examples of this where we see people pushing back against the automation of management, against the sort of centralized authority that these algorithms and these massive data sets give the people in power over workers. And then I will mention you've also seen tech workers organizing. I've been a part of a number of those efforts and organizing against the creation of some of these technologies, saying we don't actually want to build unethical or surveillance systems, and since we don't have checks on these, we need to figure out new forms of accountability to stop them right now.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask one more question. We're almost out of time. Ms. Tourassi, or Dr. Tourassi, I'm sorry. I know that Oak Ridge has been a partner with the Veterans Health Administration on MVP Champion, I think it's called. And if you could just talk a little bit about, is that project an example of the way that the VA can be a leader in AI as it relates to medicine, precision medicine? You know, we've got this 7 million veteran patient population, and in a number of IT areas, we think of it as a leader that can help advance the field. Are you seeing that, or are there more things we could be doing?
The particular program you described, it's part of the Strategic Partnerships program that brings the AI and high-performance computing expertise that exists within the DOE National Lab System with the application domain and effectively the data owners as well. So that partnership is what's pushing the field forward in terms of developing technologies that we can deploy in the environment of the VA administration to improve veterans' healthcare. I wouldn't consider the Veterans Administration as spearheading artificial intelligence, but as I said in my written testimony, talent alone is not enough. You need to have the data, you need to have the compute resources, and you need to have talent. The two entities coming together, they create that perfect synergy to move the field forward.
Well, thank you for that. And I do believe that labs like yours and the efforts that we make in the VHA system are a way that we can help push back against the bias and discrimination in this field, because the government really, at its best, has tried to be a leader in building a diverse workforce of all kinds and allowing workers, at least in the Veterans Administration, to organize and be part of this whole discussion. So hopefully we can keep moving that forward. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I've been in Congress for about 23 years, and in every committee we focus on diversity, economic disruption, wages, and privacy. And we've dealt with that here today as well. I want to focus on something else that is more than a decade away. And that is that the most explosive power in the universe is intelligence. 200,000 years ago or so, our ancestors said hello to Neanderthal. It did not work out well for Neanderthal. That was the last time a new level of intelligence came to this planet, and it looks like we're going to see something similar again, only we are the Neanderthal. We have, in effect, two competing teams. We have the computer engineers represented here before us, developing new levels of intelligence. And we have the genetic engineers, quite capable in the decades to come of inventing a mammal with a brain of hundreds of pounds. So the issue before us today is whether our successor species will be carbon-based or silicon-based, whether the planet will be inherited by those with artificial intelligence or biologically engineered intelligence. There are those who say that we don't have to fear any computer because it doesn't have hands. It's in a box, it can't affect our world. Let me assure you that there are many in our species that would give hands to the devil in return for a good stock tip. The chief difference between the artificial intelligence and the genetically engineered intelligence is survival instinct. With DNA, it's programmed in. You try to kill a bug, it seems to want to survive. It has a survival instinct, and you could call it survival instinct, you could call it ambition. You go to turn off your washing machine, or even the biggest computer that you've worked with, you go to unplug it, it doesn't seem to care. What what percentage of all the research being done on artificial intelligence is being used to detect and prevent self-awareness and ambition? Does anybody have an answer to that? Otherwise, I'll ask you to ask for the record. Yes, sir.
We have an AI safety team at OpenAI, and a lot of that work is about, if I set an objective for a computer, it will probably solve that objective, but it will sometimes solve that objective in a way that is incredibly harmful to people, because, as other panelists have said, these algorithms are kind of dumb.
Right.
What you can do is you can try and have these systems learn values from people.
Learning values is nice. What are you doing to prevent self-awareness and ambition?
The idea is that if we encode the values that people have into these systems, and so for
I
objectives are
don't
set by
want to
them,
be replaced by a really nice new form of intelligence. I'm looking for a tool that doesn't seek to affect the world. I want to move on to another issue related, though. I think you're familiar with the Turing test, which in the 1950s was proposed as the way we would know that computers had reached or exceeded human intelligence, and that is, could you have a conversation with a computer and not know you were having a conversation with a computer? In this room in 2003, top experts of then predicted that the Turing test would be met by 2028. Does anybody here have a different view? Is that as good an estimate as any? They said it would be 25 years, and that was back in 2003. Not seeing anybody jump up with a different estimate, so I guess we have that one. You're not quite jumping up, but go ahead.
Well, I don't have an estimate on that. I do question the validity of the Turing test insofar as it relies on us to define what a human is, which is, of course, a philosophical question that we could debate for hours.
Well, I don't know about philosophers, but the law pretty well defines who's a human and who isn't. And of course, if we invent new kinds of sentient beings, the law will have to grow. I just want to add, Mr. Beyer brought this up and was kind of dismissed by the idea that we shouldn't worry about a new level of intelligence since we, as of yet, don't have a computer that can drive a car without hitting a child. I think it's important that if we're going to have computers drive cars, that they not hit children. But that's not a reason to dismiss the fact that between biological engineering and computer engineering, we are the Neanderthal creating our own Cro-Magnon. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Horn.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to the panel for an important and interesting conversation today. I think it's clear that each time we as society or as humans experience a massive technological shift or advancement, it brings with it both opportunities and ways to make our life better or easier or move more smoothly, and also challenges and dangers that are unknown to us in the development of that. And what I've heard from several of you today goes to the heart of this conversation, the need to balance the ethical, social, and legal implications with the technological advancement and the need to incorporate that from the beginning. So I want to address a couple of issues that Ms. Buolamwini, did I say that right? Okay, and Ms. Whittaker especially have addressed in turn. The first is the incorporation of bias into AI systems that we are looking at more and more in our workplaces. This isn't just a fun technological exercise. So, Ms. Buolamwini, in your testimony, you talked about inequity when it's put into the algorithms and also the need to incorporate social sciences. So my question to you is, how do we create a system that really addresses the groups that are most affected by this bias that could be built into the code and in identifying it in the process? And then what would you suggest in terms of the ability to redress that? How to identify it and redress it and address it?
Absolutely. One thing I think we really need to focus on is how we define expertise. And who we consider the experts are generally not the people who are being impacted by these systems. So looking at ways we can actually work with marginalized communities during the design, development, deployment, but also governance of these systems. So what might community review panels that are part of the process, that are in the stakeholder meetings when you're doing things like algorithmic impact assessments and so forth, how do we actually bring people in? This is also why I suggested the public interest technology clinics, right? Because you're asking about how do we get to redress. Well, you don't necessarily know how to redress the issue you never saw, right? If you are denied the job, you don't know. And so there needs to be a way where we actually give people ways of reporting or connecting. At the Algorithmic Justice League, something we do is we have bias in the wild stories. This is how I began to learn about Higher View, which uses facial analysis and verbal and nonverbal cues to inform emotional engagement or problem-solving style. We got this notification from somebody who had interviewed at a large tech company and only after the fact found out that AI was used in the system in the first place. This is something I've also asked the FTC about in terms of who do you go to when something like this happens.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Whittaker, I want to turn to you. Several of the things that you have raised are concerning in a number of ways. And it strikes me that we're going to have to address this in a technological and social sciences setting, but also as a legislative body and a Congress setting some parameters around this that allow the development, but also do our best to anticipate and guard for the problems as you've mentioned. So my question to you is, what would you suggest the role or some potential solutions that Congress could consider to take into account the challenges in workplace use of AI?
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I want to emphasize my agreement with Joy's answer there. I think, if you look at our algorithmic impact assessments, which AI Now published, which is a sort of a framework for governance, we look at kind of a multi-step process. And the first is just reviewing the components that go into a system. What is the data? What are the plans? What are the incentives to build it? The second is looking at the context where it's going to be deployed. So is it being deployed in a workplace to extract more profit for bosses? Is it being deployed in a way that is in line with worker protections and fair work laws? How do we measure that? And again, the people who are going to know whether it is according with basic protections or whether it is violating those are the people on the ground who experience it. The engineers in a Silicon Valley office at a whiteboard aren't going to have that information. They don't instrument these systems to collect that data. So it is imperative that oversight involve both the technical and the on-the-ground context and treat the on-the-ground experience as expertise.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stevens.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Artificial intelligence, societal and ethical implications. Likely the most important hearing taking place in this body today, with profound implications on our future and obviously our present-day reality. Likely the time we've allotted for this hearing is not enough. In fact, it might just be the beginning. We've referenced it before, our proverb behind us, where there's no vision, the people will perish. And this is certainly an area where we need profound vision, a push towards the implications, and something that Ms. Buolamwini's statement in your testimony jumped out at me, which is that we have arrived overconfident and underprepared for artificial intelligence. And so I was wondering if each one of our panelists could talk about how we, not just as legislators, are overconfident. In fact, I just think we're behind, but how we are underprepared. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the reasons we're overconfident is, as I said in my opening statement, that a lot of what we learn about AI is marketing from companies who want to sell it to us. So there's a lot of hype around how it solves problems, around magical efficiencies, around its ability to cure certain disease or to diagnose diseases better than other practices, right? But what we don't have right now, how we are underprepared, is we've had 20 years where we're not examining these systems, where we have allowed the tech industry to basically regulate itself and sort of given the future over to those who are in business to sell tech. So I think we need to reverse that, right? One of the recommendations AI Now has made in the past is truth in advertising laws to claims about AI. Validate it before you say it, and if you say it without validation, there are going to be penalties.
We're overconfident when it comes to believing these systems are repeatable and reliable. And as the testimonies have shown, that's repeatable for some, reliable for some. That's an area where people typically get stuff wrong. As a society, we're underprepared because we're under-oriented. We don't know where this technology is going. We don't have granular data on how it's being developed. And the data that we do have is born out of industry, which has its own biases. So we need to build systems in government to let us measure, assess, and forecast this technology.
First, I want to attribute Kathy O'Neill for we've arrived in the age of automation overconfident. I added underprepared because of all of the issues that I was seeing. And I do think part of the overconfidence is the assumption that good intentions will lead to a better outcome. And so oftentimes I hear people saying, well, we want to use AI for good. And I ask, do we even have good AI to begin with? Or are we sending parachutes with holes? When it comes to being underprepared, so much reliance on data is part of why I use the term data is destiny, right? And if our data is reflecting current power shadows, current inequalities, we're destined to fail those who have already been marginalized.
So what we covered today was very nicely the hope, the hype, and the hard truth of AI. We covered every aspect. And actually, this is not new. The AI technologies that existed in the 90s, they went through the same wave. What's different now is that we're moving a lot faster because of access to data and access to compute resources. And there is no doubt that we will produce code much faster than we can produce regulations and policies. This is the reality. Therefore, I believe that investments, strategic investments in R&D, so that we can consistently and continuously benchmark data sets that are available for development of AI technology to capture biases to the extent that we can foresee these biases, and continuously benchmark AI technology, not only from the point of deployment, but as a quality control throughout its lifetime, that needs to be part of our approach to the problem.
Well, thank you so much. And for the record, I just wanted to make note that earlier this year in this 116th Congress, I had the privilege of joining my colleague from Michigan, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, and our other colleague, Congressman Ro Khanna, to introduce H.R. Resolution 153, which supports the development of guidelines for the ethical development of artificial intelligence. So it's a resolution, but it's a step in that direction. And certainly as this committee continues to work with the National Institute of Standards and Technologies and all of your fabulous expertise, we'll hopefully get to a good place. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questioning period. And I want to remind our witnesses that the record will remain open for 2 weeks for any additional statements from you or members or any additional questions of the committee. The witnesses are now excused. I thank you profoundly for being here today, and the hearing is adjourned.